Thank you very much, Director. You didn't mention the most important part of my CV, my spouse. I want to start, before diving into the substance, just by thanking everybody involved in the Holberg experience, all of the people who served on the committee, the chair of the committee, who is exiting off, the director of the board, and everybody who's made this few days this week, which is so special to my husband and to our family, for making these days and this experience possible. I have a unique perspective, if I may, which is that I got to see Cass and hear from Cass when he was informed that he had won the Holberg Prize. And what was most moving, I think, about Cass's reaction, and is most clearly a tribute to all of you, is how seen he felt when he read the citation in particular. The award, of course, is an incredible honor and an incredible gift, but the citation is very, very special because it speaks, I think, to the range of what Cass has been up to over these last decades, the linkages, it saw linkages across fields that most people have treated as separate and as siloed. And what Cass said in the relatively immediate wake of having read the citation was, they really seem to get what I've been trying to do. And given how much Cass has written, and the range of topics, that's just a tribute to the care, I think, that people involved in the Holberg Prize put in to that effort. So thank you. Special thanks also to Tali Sharot, to Tyler Cowan, and to Larry Lessig, who are really, from Cass's perspective, I think, just a dream team of people to participate in a symposium that touches upon some of the themes of his work. But sitting next to him here for the last hour and a half and watching him delight in the ideas that are being shared and scribbling notes and learning in the way that he does in every experience has been a special treat. But it isn't easy also for people to leave their home turf and fly to Bergen, Norway. And so the three individuals who came are also distinct, I think, in Cass's life and career in that they always show up. These are people who show up for Cass. And I'm personally very grateful. Just to say a word, if I may, about Professor Sunstein. I think I am most struck in looking at the body of work that he has done over so many years, at how ahead of his time he has so often been. And I think the topic for today's symposium is the one in which that is arguably the most clear. Cass wrote Republic.com back in 2001, 17 years ago, really anticipating some of the cleavages in our society, the insularity many of us would find through the new technologies that also offered such promise and continue, as has been said, to offer great promise. But he was so alert to the risks of the creation of echo chambers and the way we would select out according to our preferences, as Tali's work spoke to this morning. And of course, he's adapted his thinking over the years, but to give us that amount of forewarning to parts of the predicament that we find ourselves confronting today, I think is incredibly important. His work is also often just very timely. It was only months after the advent of the Trump administration when Cass coincidentally published a book entitled Impeachment, a Citizen's Guide. He claims it has nothing to do with the current political situation. It doesn't mention Donald Trump, but nonetheless. And most recently, he has published a very important edited collection entitled Can It Happen Here? Authoritarianism in the United States. And these, again, are just examples of what he's doing with his left pinky when most of us would require body and soul to be invested in any one of these topics. And again, the caliber of the work is I think, unrivaled. An under-heralded feature, I think, of Cass's work that Tyler kind of touched upon, but that I want to draw out here, is the emphasis across his work, which the committee saw, the emphasis on dignity, on human dignity. And this was a great privilege of mine to happen to be married to Cass while he was in charge of regulation for the Obama administration. And he's very well known for his celebration of cost-benefit analysis as a means of disciplining the regulatory state. But he's not as well known for his appreciation that dignity has to be a part of the calculus. And so, again, an under-heralded feature of the Obama administration's approach to regulation was that in weighing the costs and benefits of a particular regulation, dignity was its own variable. So if you're making a judgment about, in the United States, about how much of a strain or how much cost should be incurred in order to accommodate the rights of people with disabilities, in order to update some of the regulations and some of the standards of accommodation, it's not enough simply to quantify the actual cost to business to making those changes, but you also must look at what it would be like to be a person in a wheelchair who can't actually turn their wheelchair around in a bathroom facility. That is a cost that has to be measured in understanding regulation. So watching him bring these ideas to life and emphasize dignity in the way that he did was extraordinary. The last thing I'd say before diving into the topic at hand is I am asked occasionally, and have been asked here in the 24 hours I've been in Bergen, what's it like to be married to Cass Sunstein? And my first answer is that initially it was extremely disconcerting because you'd be having dinner and it'd be very romantic, wonderful dinner. He's a very loving husband and devoted father, and you'd be so focused on one another. And then you'd leave, I would leave, maybe to use the restroom or just to go into the other room. And even if I was only gone 2 or 3 minutes, I would come back and his laptop would be out and he'd be writing. And it was very disconcerting. But as soon as I came back, he would just tuck the laptop away and we'd pick up right where we left off. I'd go occasionally, initially in the early years of our marriage, I made the mistake occasionally of bringing him shopping with me when I was going shopping. And I'd go into the wardrobe, the spouse has one job, which is to weigh in on what it is you might be buying. But I'd come out of the changing room, and there Cass would be sitting on the floor, cross-legged, typing. And then he'd come out, put the computer away, and so every minute is spent, I should add, in each of these circumstances, as he's typing, he's a huge smile on his face, especially when he's reading criticisms of his work. It's totally bizarre. So that's my long answer. It can be disconcerting to be married to Cass and to see the way he uses the crevices in his days to explore all of these ideas. But the shorter answer, it is awesome to be married to Cass Sunstein. So thank you for marrying me. Okay, so the remarks I will give now touch upon where Tyler left off, the autocracy cascade. Is there one? What are the sources of crisis for democracy, which is what a lot of people feel right now. And I'm just going to divide my talk into 2 parts. The beginning will be the Samantha part, and the back will be the Cass part. So the Samantha part is the dark and gloomy, depressed part, looking at the structural forces that are really, that have in fact brought about something resembling a retreat when it comes to democracy around the world. The last part is the upbeat part where, despite knowing all of that, one can still see a path forward and where one has to recognize the inherent sturdiness of the democratic model, which should give us hope. So first, the crisis to and of democracy in retreat. We are in the midst of a crackdown on human rights and a decline in democratic metrics, at least, which I'll come to, that is the most significant, at least since the end of the Cold War. Every measure of political and civil freedom assessed by Freedom House, so freedom of expression and belief, rule of law, freedom of association and assembly, individual rights, the functioning of government, free electoral processes, levels of pluralism, participation, have declined from 10 years ago for the world as a whole. Disturbingly, in 2016 and 2017, it was in established democracies, those countries that are deemed fully free in the taxonomy. It is in those countries that the worst setbacks were experienced. But overall, 71 countries in 2017 suffered net declines in those variables that I've described. And again, this is the 12th straight year in which net declines have outnumbered net improvements. Close to 100 governments have, I think in part for their own reasons, in part learning from one another in a kind of race to the bottom, have adopted laws impinging upon freedom of association and freedom of assembly, which of course are rights that are enabling rights that make it possible for people to gather and hold their governments accountable. So I've heard activists in Ethiopia, in fact, refer to this not as rule of law, but rule by law. These are really, really important uses of law to impede democratic debate and pluralism. Now, why is democracy suffering reputationally and practically in these ways? I think a lot of people here in this audience will have different theories. Just to lay out a few of the obvious factors, there was a profound backlash, understandably, against the US invasion of Iraq and the devastating consequences that ensued, an invasion that was couched by some at least as an invasion on behalf of democracy. But in the United States, in the wake of that war and the long war in Afghanistan, there has been a great fatigue that has taken hold across the country. A fatigue over international engagement, a kind of unfortunate conflation of the use of military force, which understandably and justifiably should cause a counter reaction, but a conflation between that and US leadership in certain quarters, and the polling, I think, reflects this, but also a crisis of confidence around America's capacity to lead, and that is something that I think has had bearing on US leadership as it relates also to democracy promotion. Funding since the end of the Cold War in the United States for democracy, for not particular political parties or particular outcomes, but for the infrastructure of democracy has plummeted. And that's including, in fact, under President Obama. Not the same kind of support there was when there was a Soviet Union and this was deemed part of some larger existential struggle. As Tyler alluded to, a perception that the China model is working. The assertion that was made over many, many years that you couldn't have sustained economic growth without democracy, challenged now by the economic viability and indeed prowess of what China has managed to do, which I'll come back to. A failure, relatively speaking, of the color revolutions in Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan back in the 2003-2005 period. Then, of course, the most visible and violent retreat in the wake of the Arab Spring and all of the hope around democratization that accompanied the early days of those revolutions, whether in Tunisia, where there's still a democracy plodding along, but where there are real struggles economically for people living in the country and real questions about the democracy dividend. Egypt, where there has been massive backsliding, now arguably to a level of repression that even exceeds that of Mubarak. And Syria, most tragically, resulting in a degree of carnage that we haven't seen in generations. So with all of this, of course, that's if the Arab Spring is going to be the poster child for democracy, the reputation, of course, is going to suffer. Burma, a sense that with the liberalization in Burma, a success story until very recently, that what has been unleashed is a will and a desire on the part of sort of mob violence, mob communities that constitute mobs, and by the government itself to take aim at ethnic minorities, most particularly the Rohingya. There's also, I think, part of the despair is a despair in the international system, in the so-called liberal international order, and a sense that we have proven unable to put our heads together and to pool our resources in the way that the founders of the post-war institutions expected us, demanded in effect that we do. And the most vivid and devastating example of this, of course, I think is the refugee crisis, where you have 67 million people displaced, many of whom across international borders, and where in democracies and dictatorships or autocracies alike, the temptation has been to close one's borders. And if any particular country or countries close one's borders or limit doing their share of the larger, carrying their share of the larger global burden, that has a cascading effect on other countries. So when the United States this year, for instance, takes 12 Syrian refugees, it's not going to be altogether surprising that other countries are going to take their cue, and that the number of slots or the number of places where people can find refuge shrinks even further than it has been in recent years. But a sense that, yes, there's a collective action problem, but that the pieces that comprise the larger institutional frameworks that we have, that each of the dysfunction or the politics within each of them then give rise to these kinds of outcomes that render the whole system less effective than it needs to be. And then, of course, back to the United States, a sense, not only in the United States, but in other Western democracies, that whatever the virtues of democracy, it has not, with some exceptions, including Norway, but that it has not delivered on the promise of equality alongside that of macro prosperity. Moreover, the advent of very pernicious forms of polarization, which I will come back to, brought about by money in politics, by gerrymandering, and by some of the echo chambers and other sort of media distortions that Cass has touched upon in his work. So on the one hand, Donald Trump is a symptom of some of these larger phenomenon. On the other hand, he's also, I believe, exacerbating some of these trends. And we've seen it with a kind of contagion, as has been said. We see it with, for instance, Donald Trump introducing the idea of fake news and alternative facts, and then seeing autocratic or authoritarian leaders around the world invoking America's language, the American president's language in their own society. So you now have 21 countries: Burma, Cambodia, China, Egypt, France, Germany, Hong Kong, Hungary, Kuwait, Libya, Malaysia, the Philippines, Poland, Russia, Singapore, Somalia, Syria, Tanzania, Thailand, Turkey, and Venezuela, who have publicly accused journalists of reporting or being fake news. 21 countries. In Burma, state officials have even branded the existence of the Rohingya as fake news. And from Malaysia, we have the head of the Malaysian Communications and Multimedia Commission, I think, speaking for many when he said, quote, "When the American president made fake news into a buzzword, the world woke up," end quote. So again, this contagion, the way in which America is going to lead one way or the other, whether we're leading on behalf of democratic values and liberal institutional norms or the opposite. There's also a vacuum in light of America's relative retreat on these issues, and in light of Trump's apparent greater fondness for more autocratic leaders than for our closest allies in Europe. That has had an effect in institutions like the one where I used to work at the United Nations. When I talk to my colleagues, my former colleagues who represent Western democracies, they describe a vacuum, just that the United States is not showing up. But who is showing up is China, an empowered China, whose foreign affairs budget has doubled in the last 3 years, whose development assistance budget goes up something like 22% every year, and that's alongside the infrastructure and other investments that are made well and apart from economic development and foreign assistance. We are seeing, and I'll again touch upon this at greater length, but China stepping into the breach in international institutions, and Western democracies looking, or used to, American leadership looking around and finding themselves quite isolated. And so in the face of that, the European Union, which often struggles to develop common positions that are not watered down, shall we say, by the diversity within the European Union, finds itself now with a lot of pressure upon it to actually be a voice for democracy and for human rights within the international system, notwithstanding the structural challenge of having to speak for so many countries and having to find consensus. It is worrying that at a recent Human Rights Council session, the European Union was able to agree upon a generic, was unable to agree upon a generic human rights statement for the first time in more than a decade, because Greece, which is experiencing huge amounts of investments from China, refused to go along with a statement that listed China among other countries that violated human rights. So at least when it comes to the words and the vocal leadership of standing with people who are being repressed, which, you know, one can ask questions, I think, about the utility of that perhaps, but the muteness, the silence on the strength of the democratic model, on the importance of human rights, is quite deafening right now for people who are struggling around the world. Now, what are the longer term worries? And I'm conscious of time because I have to get to the good news, the Cass part of the talk. The longer term worries, I think, are number one, polarization, number two, China, and number three, one has to say, for now at least, foreign interference that takes advantage of open democratic political systems. So on polarization is just, in our society, in the United States, is hitting issues that, whether it's a question of fact or of value, then one would not necessarily have anticipated that they would encroach upon. So in my world, the best example is on the utility of diplomacy. Who could be against just the utility of diplomacy? Well, it turns out 83% of Democrats and only 33% of Republicans agree with the following statement: good diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace. 83% to 33%. The electorate is divided in ways with a level of virulence that we haven't seen even in a history of relatively divided democracy. In 1960, only 5% of Americans said they would be upset if their child married someone in the other political party. In 2010, 49% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats said they would be mad. We're now in 2018 and nobody has dared pull this question again. So social scientists out there, get busy, but I think this is Tali's point, we don't want this information, so we're not asking the question. In 2017, though, what we do have is data on who people actually marry, and per Pew, only 9% of Republicans and 8% of Democrats say that their spouse is a member of the other major political party. So to put this in some context, interracial marriage, we're now at 88% of Republicans, 94% of Democrats have no problem with interracial marriage. And on gay marriage, 74% of Democrats support it. And while it's less than half among Republicans, support within the Republican Party has tripled over the past 2 decades. So we're getting more tolerant, more pluralistic, bringing about equality in other areas, or at least limiting discrimination. And yet partyism, a term that Cass, of course, invented, has become a new form of ideology where people are wearing their political preferences, again, with a degree of vehemence and relative intolerance like never before. The other worry, which I touched upon but want to just dwell on a little bit, is the rise of China. Just to be very explicit about it, China is not content experiencing its model of governance within its own borders. It seeks to export that model in the same way that we, the United States and other Western democracies, have been working over time in developing countries to try to export that model. And President Xi is very explicit. As he puts it, he says, basically that China has to offer an alternative model of development that does not imitate Western values. As he says, quote, China offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence, end quote. And by independence, it means independence from the values enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international treaties, international norms. China is using its patronage, its money, to move governments and how they actually act within international institutions. Now, why does that matter? Because it's international institutions that have defined in the past at least what a right is and what a state's obligations are, what the standards are. China wants to change those standards. It's not like Russia. It doesn't want to sort of disrupt or destroy the international order from which it doesn't benefit. It has benefited from the rules of the road up to this point, but it wants to leverage its power, its mammoth and growing power, to change the rules of the road according to China's interests. And that means less curiosity by outside players as to the form of governance within a country's borders. And to give a sense, again, because sometimes I feel like we get China's rise, but we haven't really grappled with what a game changer it is likely to be on the international stage. And I find this metric the most jarring, even if it's not really on point to what I've been touching upon. But China, between 2011 and 2013, produced and used more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. That's just what's coming. That's 2011, 2013. But the United States spent $90 billion in today's dollars on the Marshall Plan. China's One Belt, One Road initiative, they're investing more than $1 trillion. Now, again, what the results are, we'll see, but a lot is being leveraged on behalf of that model. The third longer-term worry is foreign interference in elections and taking advantage of open, pluralistic political systems, as Russia did in our recent election, as Russia has sought to do in the French election, German election, and of course across Eastern Europe. And here there are several issues. One, of course, is purchase of ads and infiltration of social media, as we have seen, and as we in the Obama administration, I think, very much underestimated, I will say. The absence of umpires to discern fact from fiction. It used to be that in order to get published, you had to go through gatekeepers. So when the Soviet Union tried to do something like what they did in the 2016 election, back when they were trying to thwart Reagan's re-election, it was very hard for the information that they wanted to plant in U.S. media and in U.S. minds to get circulated, because there was fact-checking and there were umpires and so forth. That in the more Hobbesian informational domain that exists now, it's much easier to plant what one has. But then there is actual just cyber attacks, and the fact that in our recent 2016 election, you see lots of evidence of Russia going into the voter rolls, probing to see what they could do. Now, whether the intention ultimately will be to strip people of certain political parties from those rolls, technically, or whether it will be to change how people voted electronically from the person they actually voted to someone else who's preferred by a Russia or a China. The fact that we have no consensus in the United States across political parties about the importance of dealing with this threat is frankly an outrage, but it's also a grave danger. So we have got to find a way to unite on, even if we disagree on who the candidate should be that we elect, we should be able to agree on who should get to elect them. And unfortunately, the investigation related to Trump has caused the current administration in the United States to be very reluctant, I think, to prioritize this issue for fear of perhaps delegitimating the election of Trump itself. So now briefly, because I'm running out of time, the sort of Cass part, where does the consolation come from, and where are the remedies in all of this? It's a much longer conversation than we have time for here today, and perhaps we can pick up on some of these themes in the discussion. But I think it is important to look at the phenomenon that we are confronting, what Tyler alluded to as the autocratic cascade or the democratic regression, or however one thinks about it, in historical context. Many of you remember Samuel Huntington's really important essay, The Third Wave. But let's recall what Huntington actually described back in 1991. Each of the first two waves, he said, were followed by a reverse wave. So the American Revolution began, then you had the spread of democracy to Europe, Australia, New Zealand. That ended in with World War I in 1914. Then in the 1920s and 30s, you had the rise of fascism, Nazism, communism. So the first reverse wave. And here's a really interesting stat. By 1922, there were 29 democracies in the world. That number fell to 12 by 1942. The next democratic wave after World War II spread to India, the former colonies in Africa and Asia, as well as parts of Latin America. But the second reverse wave in the 60s and 70s, you saw the rise of many developing world dictatorships. When democracy was suspended in India back in 1975, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, my predecessor as ambassador to the UN, but also a former US ambassador to India, wrote, quote, "Democracy is where the world was, not where it is going," end quote. So by 1962, you had 36 democracies. By 1975, 30. There's a sense of this is going. So they're zigging and zagging, again, as Tyler put it. So maybe now we are in a third reverse wave within the Huntington context. But it's very easy to focus on our own dysfunction within democracy, our own gridlock, our own polarization, the limits of our system, the inequalities, and the way that people are being left behind. We tend to focus much less on the structural weaknesses within authoritarian and autocratic states. Inevitably, we know less. We might not speak the language, might not be able to dig in to the dysfunction there, but there is far less absorptive power within autocratic countries like that in China. And we easily forget the crash of the Shanghai stock market and the doomsday predictions about China back in 2015, 2016, the air pollution, the water contamination, the corruption, and again, the costs, the pernicious costs of an absence of democratic accountability for the costs also as it relates to the stability of the institutions themselves. The democratic idea, the power of the democratic idea, are we forgetting that? Are we forgetting that in the face of some of the most savage violence one can even contemplate in Syria, you still, in any reprieve that is offered the Syrian people, see people coming out to protest, to continue to claim the rights that are being denied them, brutally denied to them. The protests in Hong Kong, notwithstanding China's growing assertiveness over this democracy. The protests in Ethiopia, which, as Tyler noted, is a very authoritarian structure where dissent and pluralism are frowned upon in the extreme. But I think we also need to change our approach. And in some sense, as others have noted, Trump and this wave have been something of a wake-up call. There was a triumphalism around in the wake of the end of the Cold War, but that really carried through. There is a way in which, when it comes to the economic effects of globalization, those who've been left behind were often factored into sort of cold and sometimes clinical accounts of the winners and the losers. There was a sense of, well, you know, at a macro level, here are all the good things that free trade offer our society. And, you know, some automation is going to cost some jobs and some people are going to get left behind. And we need to focus on that. But look at the macro picture. And I think if nothing else, in many of our societies where inequality is so extreme and where you are seeing people who are the losers in globalization vote with their feet in terms of recent elections, this has been a wake-up call to actually focus on some of the downsides of free trade and very specifically on programs that might be able to work in order to help those who have been left behind. We need, of course, to focus on foreign interference, as I've said, with far more vehemence than we have, and find political unity over that. And it may be that among democracies, this is something that can unite us and give us a cause, if only a defensive cause. But beyond that, Democrats need to stop running for cover. Right now, you have authoritarians with a spring in their step, feeling that they are part of a cascade, learning from one another, heartened by the words and the actions of an American president. But there is so much to be proud of and so much to point to in democracies around the world. And yet, with the exception perhaps of the French president and isolated figures really in democracies around the world, one doesn't sense that kind of confidence, the defense of this model. And make no mistake, with China's rise, there is a competition, a battle, there is a marketplace for ideas, and there is a battle between two very competing models, not only of how to behave within one's borders, but also what form of leadership to project. Amid all the darkness, though, even just in the last year, while we talk about a cascade, which is fair enough, there are amazing things have happened around the world which haven't yet become part of our democracy narrative. For example, the unseating of a South African president by virtue of corruption in a country that needs to be a democratic foundation for the continent of Africa, but that has slipped backwards in profound ways. Something nobody thought was possible. The end of Robert Mugabe's rule in Zimbabwe, bloodlessly, relatively bloodlessly. And in July, just 1 month, Zimbabweans will vote for a president not called Robert Mugabe for the first time in the history of the country. In Malaysia, a country of 30 million, the unseating of an incredibly corrupt leader who has completely stifled political dissent and debate. Another election, by the way, that the pollsters got completely wrong in advance, showing, again, that democratic idea and its power, the longing for accountability, especially in the face of corruption. And women's political empowerment around the world, another huge bright spot. In the United States, Emily's List is an organization that helps support women who are trying to run for office, whether at the very local level or at the national level. Their record for the number of women approaching them for support had been set in 2016. It was 952 women had approached Emily's List. Last year, it was more than 25,000. And you see it, of course, in elections across the country. My final point is that it's quite tempting in the realm of consolation to focus also on the very narrowness of Donald Trump's victory, because Donald Trump, again, is somebody cheerleading really on behalf of some of these nativist, populist, semi-autocratic instincts, but how narrow that victory was and how many variables came into play at the last minute that might have caused the election to go a different way. But just to stress, especially for the Norwegian public, how narrow this was and how easily it could have gone the other way, 9% of the voters who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 voted for Donald Trump in 2016. 9%. 7% of the voters who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 stayed home. 4 million voters, and the election was settled by 77,000 votes spread across 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So that's how narrow it was. But maybe if Secretary Clinton had won, maybe if those 77,000 votes, or I guess 40,000 votes had gone the other way, maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation. Maybe the alarm bell would not have sounded quite so loud. And that would have been a problem in its own right. And so now we have an opportunity to emphasize some of the strengths of democracy. Remember that we can take nothing for granted because nothing is inevitable. There is no inexorable anything. The zigging and zagging is determined by the actions of citizens. Recognize that the foundation for democracy is truth, facts, arguably science as related to facts, and that even those now require a wholly different degree of active citizenship in their defense. So I think if all of us can do, as Cass has done in his work over so many years, which is to recognize that the direction that societies take, the strength of institutions, the welfare and the dignity of citizens, none of that is someone else's problem. It all comes back to the level of agency that citizens themselves exert. Thank you.